Hey, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're gonna make a circle cutting jig for my router. Stick around, the video is coming up. So I've been needing a circle cutting jig in my shop for a long time, and I've just kind of put this project off. So it's time to get it done. And the videos for making them are kind of a dime a dozen. There are a ton of different circle cutting jigs out there. I specifically wanted one that was adjustable so I wouldn't have to create multiple circle cutting jigs. I could just have one jig with my plunge router and that would be good enough. So here I'm using 1/4 inch thick MDF. Any thicker, you lose some depth of cut to your plunge router, so you don't want to use too thick of material. I started off by cutting the MDF to the width of the base of my plunge router. Then I removed the base of the router and used it for the reference holes so I knew exactly where to drill the holes for the screws and countersink them. Obviously, you want to make sure you don't countersink these holes too deep because it will weaken the MDF, and the worst thing you could do is have the router jump off in the middle of you cutting a circle on your project. So I used the head of the screws to determine how deep to countersink these, and then sprayed the holes with some polyurethane to harden them up. After that, it was time to route a groove for the adjustable knob and make a pivot point for the jig. To route the groove, I needed to use my plunge router, but I needed to create a template or a mold for the plunge router to slide into and not be able to move. Now, I was really winging it on this. I just used a bunch of boards and my hold down clamps on my assembly table to kind of hold everything in place. So I'm not going to give you any walkthrough on how I did it, but in the famous words of my friend Ted Lasso,
"Once in a blue moon, there is a game so awful that the only way to watch it back is at 10 times the speed and with the Benny Hill theme music playing under it." Here we go.
and once I was all done with that, I had this nice looking mold for my router to slide into. I got my plunge router all set up to the correct depth. Using a 1/2 inch router bit, I routed a dado into the MDF about 1/8 of an inch deep. This will create a lip for one of the washers to slide onto, creating a secure connection between the assembly piece or the pivot point and the MDF. After that groove was cut, I cleaned everything up with my shop vac. Then I cut a through dado right in the center of that groove with a 1/4 inch router bit. This will allow the screw for the assembly piece to go through the middle. Now, I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyways. Obviously, I had a sacrificial board underneath this whole thing so that I wasn't cutting into my nice router table. And more importantly, I wasn't wrecking my T-track on my assembly table. Everything turned out really nice and cut super clean, so I'm very happy with the way my mold or my sled worked. So now it's time to get the pivot point all assembled together. What you really need is 2 different sizes of washers, one a little bit bigger than the other. This little post cap that you can get from Lowe's with the screw that comes with it. And then this little brass piece that will go inside the knob. To kind of show you how this all goes together, the brass piece will screw into the screw, and the brass piece will actually be set inside the knob. Then you're going to put the bigger washer, the smaller washer, and the post cap on the back side. The post cap is what is going to be pivoted onto the wood via a little hole that you'll drill into the wood. Now, I didn't come up with this method. I saw it on a YouTube video, and I've kind of misplaced who it was, so thank you for whoever came up with this method. If you know who it is, let me know, and I'll give them credit in the description. So to get the brass piece set inside the knob, you're going to heat it up with a blowtorch on the screw that screws into it, and then just put it inside the knob and pull it until it gets all melted in there. Eventually, the plastic will harden up again, and you'll have a perfectly set little knob with the right screw size. Now the post cap is a little long, so I cut it with some of my bolt cutters and then sanded it down so it wasn't so pointy and rigid. Next, it was time to drill a hole through the top for the router bit to plunge through. This method was super easy. I just used one of my Forstner bits to mark a hole and then used my drill to drill that hole through. It doesn't have to be perfectly center. As long as the hole is wide enough for the router bit to go through, it really doesn't make a difference. Next, I got my router all set onto the router plate. It's easiest to do this kind of upside down by putting the first few screws in, and then you can flip it over and finish up tightening it to the router. You kind of want to be careful with this because the MDF is pretty soft. You could potentially break the MDF as you're connecting it to the router, but as long as you're soft, you should be fine. Next, I wanted to add a sticky tape measure to the side just so that I knew the exact size of the hole that I was going to be cutting. This was pretty easy. I just used a scrap piece of paper and drilled a hole where the pivot point started, and then plunged my router bit down into the piece of wood. This gave me 2 holes that I could see the distance between these 2 holes and set my tape measure correctly. Now, obviously, this distance is the radius of the circle, not the diameter. So wherever I put the pivot point, the circle is always going to be 2 times that size. These are pretty easy to apply. You just peel back the sticky back and press it on. So I was super excited to test this thing out. I found a scrap piece of plywood and found the center of it with the straight edge. I drilled a hole right in the center for the post to go into and got it all lifted up off of my assembly table with some bench cookies. Then I got the router all set up to the right radius for the circle. It's about an 18-inch circle. Oh, and I hopped up on my assembly table. It's nice because I have a plug that's right above my assembly table, so I don't have to worry about the cord really getting in the way. And then I just started to make my circle. I used a 1/4 inch straight bit and went into the wood about 1/8 of an inch on each pass, and just let the router and the circle cutting jig kind of do the work for me. As I got more and more comfortable with it, I went a little bit quicker on each pass, and it seemed to work out just fine. I'm super excited to have this in my shop. I can finally make round cutting boards and really anything that has a round profile on it. There are a lot of jigs that you need in your shop, and I would say that this is kind of one of those ones that's at the top of the list. It's important to have something that you can cut a round profile with, and this jig does the trick. Just to show you a little more in depth how the pivot point works. So once you've melted that thing into there, this is just gonna screw right in. Once you've melted that thing into there, this is going to screw right in. Then you're gonna put this on your board. You're gonna put the bigger washer on, then the smaller washer, and then that little post thing that we sanded down. Now you're probably looking at this going, well, you're gonna have to drill a hole for this to be a pivot point, and that's partly true. This is mainly for if you're like making rings where the center part you don't actually need, the part that you would drill in and make a hole for. You can sand this down a little bit more to have just a really pointy part. If you're making something like a cutting board, then yeah, you could make one that will be just pointy, more like a nail. But it would still go on there. You just have to make sure that you kind of hold it down and have it a little bit more secure. Well, thanks again for watching the video. I really hope you enjoyed it. It's gonna be awesome to finally have a circle cutting jig in my shop. If you haven't had an opportunity, make sure you subscribe to the channel and give this video a like if you actually liked it. And like I always say, never stop creating.